Welcome back, guys, and we're here in part three of my fifth generation of consoles retrospective or um, review, whatever you want to call it. Um, it's just me hanging out with me talking about the fifth generation of consoles, which that includes most famously the Nintendo 64, the PlayStation, and then to a lesser extent the Sega Saturn, the Panasonic 3DO, the Atari Jaguar, the Apple Pippin, etc., etc. But unfortunately, I can only show you the ones that I own from that generation, and for them I only own the Sega Saturn, the 64, and the PlayStation. But yeah, here we are talking about the Sega Saturn. This, I believe, is possibly the most underrated video game console of all time. So a little bit of history before we start talking about it. So Sega, right? They used to, for those who don't know, maybe they're a little younger, they used to make consoles back in the 80s and 90s and the very early 2000s. So they came out with the Sega SG-1000, which later was known as the Sega Master System, and that console did not do it did not do very well here in America because the Nintendo basically outshined it, and everybody had a Nintendo. But the Sega Master System did very well in South America, specifically Brazil. Um, it was a huge success over there. It did very good in Europe. The Sega Master System was on par with Nintendo on the NES in Europe, and it did decent, okay in Japan. Again, Nintendo still outsold it. Then when it came to the Sega Genesis, that was Sega's biggest success. They blew up in North America. Um, did almost on par even, with the Super Nintendo here in North America. Did okay in South America, Australia. Did okay in Europe, or fairly well. But unfortunately, in Japan, it didn't sell that well. Actually, it was blown out of the water by the Super Nintendo or the Super Famicom, known over there. And also, it was outsold by the PC Engine, otherwise known as the TurboGrafx 16. Here in America, the TurboGrafx 16, nobody had it. But in Japan, it was called the PC Engine, and it was actually in second place. And it did way better than the Genesis did in Japan. So it was very weird. So then it came 1994, right? And they're like, okay, the Genesis. Sega of Japan was like, okay, we need to move on from the Genesis. It's not doing very well here, so let's come up with our third console, which would be the Saturn. But Sega of America said, wait, the Genesis is doing extremely well here. We kind of don't want to just move on from it. You know, you know, right now. But then unfortunately, you know, Sega of Japan called the shots, so Sega of America had to follow suit. But here's a theory, right? We don't know if Sega of Japan was it or it was Sega of America, but it had to be one of those two. There's two different versions of the story where they pitched in the 32X. So brief history: the 32X was an add-on to the Sega Genesis, which upped the RAM and basically gave it better specs. Turned it into a 32-bit machine instead of a 16-bit machine. Kind of like how we have, the PS4, PS4 Pro, Xbox One, and then the Xbox One X. Kind of like that, but it was meant to be like, the next generation, because they're like, we want to keep the Sega Genesis name. The brand is good. We don't want to move on from it. But this is how of a dumb and bad idea was that it was they were clashing with each other in ideas, Sega of Japan and Sega of America, to the point that the Sega Saturn in Japan came out the same day as the Sega 32X did in America, because the 32X only came out in America, where the Genesis was a success. It didn't come out in Japan because there was no need to. It's like, why are we going to release this peripheral that improves the console in the country that didn't do well? Let's just come out with a brand new console. And then they dropped the 32X within like 6 months after release, so it burnt a lot of developers. It made them lose faith in Sega, made the customers lose faith in Sega, because it's like, wow, Sega, you were doing so good with the Genesis. We trusted you. It's like, imagine you bought a Genesis, and then Sega goes, oh, you've had your Genesis for what, 4 or 5 years already. The new generation is coming up. We're hitting the mid '90s, which was the start of the next generation. Here, buy a 32X. It makes your Genesis go from 16-bit to 32-bit and improvement. And you're like, wow, okay, so you fork in $150, right, for the 32X, and then 6 months later, right, Sega says, actually, no, the 32X that you just bought, drop that. We're coming out with the brand new console, the Saturn. So you're gonna be like, what the heck, Sega, stuff like that. And then it was a very disorganized time for Sega because Sega of America and Sega of Japan, they were clashing ideas. They couldn't they couldn't agree on anything, um, and unfortunately it's what led to their downfall. Because then I guess here comes the history of this. So this came out in '94 in Japan and '95 in America, and I believe rest of the world, right? So the day this came out, right, late '94 in Japan, the Sega 32X, they add on for the Genesis, came out in America the same day, which is like, wow, you guys are cannibalizing, your own sales and stuff. So then they're like, no, dude, you gotta cut the 32X. We gotta move on to the Saturn. So then they did, right? But the threat, right, of Sony was imminent, right? Sega was noticing how in Japan the PlayStation already come out in '94 as well, around the same time this came out in Japan, and they were killing it, right? They were killing it. They were killing it. The Saturn was doing very well as well, um, but the PlayStation was killing it, and all the games they were showing, the promises, of all the companies they were working with, all the third-party games moving over to Sony, from Nintendo. Sorry, because a lot of third parties like Square Enix and a few others, Konami, they moved on from Super Nintendo to the PlayStation because the Nintendo 64 was going to use cartridges, and everybody was pissed off. They're like, nope, we're moving on to CDs. CDs is the futures. Nintendo using cartridges, we're not going to work with you. We're going to work with Sony on PlayStation. So, right, all the companies now are working with Sony, and then so third parties are coming mostly to Sony, but then some to here, and then each console has have their exclusive. So Sega felt very threatened. They're like, oh crap, we need to do something, so that we can have a leg up in America. So come E3 1995, right? E3 takes place in around the summer, so like May, June. That's usually where it would take place. So in 1995, right? Um, that's where they show the new consoles, new games coming out, etc., etc. Um, right? Typically, consoles come out in November or sometime in the fall. Late of the year. But Sega says, you know what, we need to have something up, so let's just release the Sega Saturn like 6 months early, so that we have 6 months extra time, to build up our sales, so the Saturn, gets sales, and we can outpace Sony with the PlayStation that's coming up. But and them doing that, right? They pissed off developers, and also the retails. Because retailers, right? Like Walmart, GameStop, etc., Best Buy, they're like, whoa, dude, what the heck? We were ready for the shipments in like November, or preparing for November. What the heck? What do you mean like that? Like the shipments are coming this week. We don't have room and inventory for that. Etc. So you're pissing them off. But you piss off developers, right? Because the developers making the games, for the Saturn, they're like, okay, the deadline is sometime for the fall, right? And then Sega comes in and is like, hey, yeah, random developer, Capcom or whatever, right? Yeah, so your game that you're making for us, yeah, the deadline is not like in the fall. It's like next week, and they're gonna be like, what the heck? So it was very weird, right? So they announced it that it was coming out in May, right? They're like, you know what? It's coming out like like this week or whatever, or right now. So it was a pleasant surprise, I guess, for the consumers, because the consumers don't have to worry about that stuff. When cool things, they announce cool things like trailers for new things. You want it now, right? So for you, it's like, whoa, it's out now, awesome. Um, you know, but for the people making the games, people behind the scenes, it was a nightmare for them, right? Two, right? When they were seeing how capable and how strong the PlayStation was gonna be, with with the graphics and the CPU power and the GPU power. Sega looked back at the Saturn and they're like, oh crap, this is a little underpowered. Let's add in another 30 another processor. So I believe, um, from what I was researching and from what I hear a lot, is that they did it very very unpreparedly and very fast. So they're just like, screw it, let's just like throw in another processor. So from what I notice, I mean, and from what I would hear is that um, game developers, they couldn't use the full potential of the console right away because it was very difficult to develop for. One thing that Sony had as well is that not only did they had a more powerful machine, with the PlayStation, but they also had a machine that was easier to develop for. It was easier to program for games. So it's like, say you're a developer, right? And you have this machine, right? That's very easy to develop and it's very, it's more powerful. So your game's going to look better, run faster, it's just a more powerful machine. Or there's this console that's harder to develop, but it's also, less powerful, it's weaker, has, worse graphics, etc., etc. So it's like that made the PlayStation more attractive, and it's just a lot of like panic ideas, wrong ideas, miscommunications, the Sega had, internally, from the different divisions, like from America and Japan, etc. That unfortunately turned this out to be one of the most botched launch in history, aside from the Xbox One. But anyways, so yeah, so it was unfortunate, and then yeah, so then it comes out, right. Nobody, nobody was expecting it. There weren't games for it, and the games that would come out, they were like incomplete because the people making the games, they would be like, "Wow, we, our schedule was, to work on the game all the way until fall and then ship it," but instead, we were told to like, "Yeah, the deadline is like next week." So it was very unfortunate. Another thing too is that led for it to not do very well in America. It did poorly in America. Nobody knows of this thing back in the day, and people that do, or were either very huge Sega fanatics or from retrospective, like now, we're looking back. Um, Although I will say this definitely more. This was more successful than stuff like the Panasonic 3DO, the Atari Jaguar, and the Apple Pippin. Right, those consoles are far more obscure. But yeah, so it sold poorly here in America. It did, I think, almost as poorly in places like Australia, South America, Europe, but it did very well in Japan. In Japan, this thing was doing very well. Um, it outsold the Nintendo 64. That's still a part that gets me to this day. It's like, wow, the Nintendo 64 must have been a very unattractive machine in Japan for the Sega Saturn to outsell the Nintendo 64. And yeah, so it did very good in Japan, but still, the PlayStation outsold it and outsold everything from that generation, in every region. Um, but yeah, another thing too is that unfortunately, also a lot of games, right, that came out in Japan stayed in Japan. Not a lot of them were ported over, in America or anywhere else in Europe, Australia, etc. So you have a library of, I want to say, around 1,200 to 1,500, right? That's like a rounding up right there. So that's the whole library of the Sega Saturn. But only around like 200 and something, like almost 300 games came out here in America. So it's like you got like another like 1,000 games, or another like 1,100 games or whatever, still stuck in Japan. And unfortunately, due to that, I guess, this talks about retrospectively, this makes it a very impossible and a very hard console to go back and get some games if you want to play or collect for. Since this wasn't sold well, right? It's very difficult to look for. So if you go to eBay right now or anywhere, it's very rare that you come across a Saturn and Saturn games, right? But since it did very well in Japan, it's easier to find. These are everywhere. Sega Saturns are everywhere. The games are everywhere. Controllers, everything, are everywhere. So, so for you to not break your bank, right? Because due to them not being everywhere, and them being rare here in America, everything is expensive. You want to go get a Saturn, it's expensive. games are, oh my god, games are like definitely well in like the hundreds. The most infamous one is Panzer Dragoon Saga, which is a $1,400 game. It's a $1,400 game on eBay. That's crazy, right? So things like that, it makes this console also, when you're going back to it retrospectively, it's not very collector friendly, budget friendly. But if you go in the import route in Japan, it's you find a lot of great stuff very cheap because it was popular over there. And that's what you see here for my collection. All of these are Japanese games. I think I only have one American Sega Saturn game. That's because it came with the console. Because if I were to go out and buy individually a game, it's a lot. Like even the sports games, usually sports games are like the cheapest in any console. Like in any single console, sports games are always the most worthless, cheapest games. Even those are like upwards like 60, 70, $80, which is insane. Maybe I seen some for like 40 or 30. Maybe but from what I'm seeing, maybe I'm not looking in the right places. Like now we're seeing it for that high. But anyways, I guess that was the history for that, for the Sega Saturn, and some retrospective looking back if you want to look and collect the console. I guess post launch, as this console was struggling in America, the marketing was very weird, right? And unfortunately, the president of Sega of America, right? He saw how Sega was handling the Saturn and how everything they were doing dumb decisions. So he did a great job with the Sega Genesis. He marketed very well. He's the one that pushed, the Genesis does when Nintendo don't campaign. He's the one that told, he's like, we have to bundle Sonic on the Sega Genesis and make it cheaper than the Super Nintendo so we can get, sell. And, so he did an amazing job with the Genesis. But he saw that it was no hope for the Saturn because, Sega of Japan calls the shots and they weren't working with, willing to work with him, kind of like they were with the Genesis, to do all these things. And he left. He left around that 95, 96, and then we had Bernie Stoller come in for Sega of America. And yeah, he didn't do a lot of good choices either with the Saturn. Unfortunately, he did a lot of the games. The reason why the North American library is so small, right? Only like 200 something games compared to like the 12 to 1500 games in Japan, is because he kind of like blocked a lot of the games coming over, which is I always found that very dumb. I'm like, I've never liked any console, right? Any console, any game. I've never liked it when it's only like for one region, like it only comes out in Japan and never in America or anywhere else. I'm like, why? Like just everywhere, like who cares? Like just everywhere. But unfortunately, that's the thing. So that's if you want to get Saturn games, go to look them up and import them from Japan. And then unfortunately, Bernie Solar says pretty much the dumbest thing you can ever say. Where around, I believe it was 1996 or 1997, in an interview, they asked, what are your plans for the Sega Saturn, and moving forward with it, plans with it, to make it a more attractive machine, for people to buy. And he literally said the Sega Saturn is not our future. So it's like, and they wanted to move on like only 2 years after the consoles come out. So it's like, wow, that's kind of like very dumb because you got Sega fans, right? Imagine you're a Sega fan, right? You bought the Master System when it comes out, right? Or maybe you didn't. Maybe you bought the Genesis, their second console, because that's the one that blew up. That's the one that made people go from Nintendo to Sega, right? The Sega Genesis, because of Sonic and other great games. So you have a Genesis, you're enjoying it, right? Then Sega sells you on the Sega CD, oh my god, CDs, stuff like that, an add-on. You plug it into the side or the bottom of your Genesis, and you have CD gaming. Then you buy that, right? So you buy this add-on. It's a bunch of crappy FMV games, point and click games. So you're like, oh, all right, I guess I can't believe I bought that. Then it tells you, no, you know what? The 32X. This is what makes your Genesis into the next generation. 16-bit, it turns into a 32-bit machine. You buy the 32X. Crappy games come out for it, and then within like 6 months later, they drop the thing like a dirty shirt. And then they're like, no, that's not. This is the next generation, the Saturn. And you're like, shit, okay, I guess. And then you buy the Saturn. And then 2 years later, like, yeah, the Saturn's not our future. We're going to move on to a different machine, a different console. Only 2 years after you bought the thing. So it's like, people at that time, they were losing faith with it. So you got consumers losing faith, you got developers losing faith. Most famously, EA, right? They would make all the sports games for like the Genesis, right, and the Saturn, and that's what made them stop support for the Saturn. And unfortunately, when the Dreamcast came out, right, their fourth console, and that was a very good machine. A lot of people, a lot of people will agree with you. The Sega Dreamcast is an amazing console, but unfortunately, due to the bad decisions that Sega were making with the Saturn and the 32X and all the crazy add-ons for the Genesis, it made EA just like, what, we don't want to work with you anymore. Even though unfortunately the Dreamcast is a very good machine, EA never put a single game on it. So you got stuff like that. Other companies, they were done with Sega. And another thing is that this does not have a mainline Sonic game, which is like, wow, that's like if Nintendo comes out with a console, they don't have a mainline Mario game, right? For whatever Nintendo console, it's kind of like, what the heck. This does have Sonic games, right? The Sega Saturn has Sonic games on it, but they're either spin-offs or like a compilation port of like the Genesis games. But like a true mainline Sonic game, they don't have one, and it was because Yuji Naka, the creator of Sonic, right? Sega told him, "Hey, why you can create another? Why don't you create another mascot type game? And you don't have to only make Sonic. You can make whatever you like, and we will handle Sonic." And that's where Sonic Extreme, the infamous game that was supposed to come out, the big mainline Sonic game for the Saturn, but it never came out because it was a development hell for them. But yeah, here are also the controllers I'm going to show you guys. It came out with this big, kind of bulky looking controller. It reminds me of the six button Genesis variation of the controller, right? The D-pad is a little weird. The triggers, they click kind of weird. It's just how it's built. So it's not a very good controller. It's all right, I can handle it, but it's not very good. But this is a huge improvement. Then they came with like the smaller controller in Japan, and then they brought this one over in America, and the triggers are so much better. The D-pad, oh my god, I legit think this is the best D-pad of all time. Like this and like the Super Nintendo D-pad, this is the best D-pad of all time, and it's just more ergonomic. So if you guys can see right there. So it's just, kind of like a smaller, slim controller. And yeah, but then around the time where the Nintendo 64 came out, and we had the analog sticks. Obviously, Sony then came out with the DualShock, with the dual analog sticks, and then Sega came out with this for the Saturn, which is, they call it the 3D controller, which has the analog stick now, because games are now using analog sticks. The triggers are actually like triggers, like analog triggers instead of just the buttons, and you still keep your 6 face buttons, your D-pad, and your start. And then also you switch it from your digital mode D-pad and then you switch it over to analog mode, so make it primarily use this. So yeah, pretty cool. It looks very similar to the Dreamcast controller. You can see how this was like the prototype version and how they evolved this going to their next console, the Dreamcast, because it does remind me of like a prototype Dreamcast controller. So yeah, so this came with this bundle with the Knights game, right? So it's pretty cool because it's I believe it's the first game that made heavy use of like the 3D analog controller, so you can move around and stuff. But yeah, so that's some history for the Sega Saturn. I wish it did very good. This is an amazing console. It's just unfortunate that it's very underrated and not as well known. But I really do think if you guys are ever interested in it, I would say definitely pick up for it. If you're gonna get a console, I would say go for the Japanese version. They're much cheaper, and then pick up some Japanese games. I would say try to, even though as much as I love JRPGs and then story-based games, unless you can read Japanese and speak Japanese, don't get those, because those have very they're text-heavy games, with a lot of text, and it's like Japanese. I can't read them or anything like that. And then try to get this controller, right, over this one. It's just a better controller over this one. And then if you're gonna play some of the later 3D games like Nights into Dreams or anything like that, I'll pick up a 3D controller. But yeah, and then I guess let me show you the console. Right, right? So here we have the North American Saturn, right? Here we have the button. So this would be the power button. This would be the reset button. This would be the open or the eject button. It opens up. You see, I have a game here. Is Jurassic Park: The Lost World. But yeah, it opens up, and then you just close it like that. And then here is the port for the memory card, right? And on the back you have your basic inputs right here. I don't know if you can see, just stuff like that. And then your two controllers. So yeah, this is the North American Saturn. Here we have the Japanese Sega Saturn. Same thing. You got your buttons, your power, your reset, and your open button here. I don't have a game in here. I have the Lost World here, but I don't have anything here. Two controller ports and the back with different ports. And then here we have the memory card slot, which can also you could also fit memory cards, and I would say also RAM expansions to make the RAM. So this, for example, right? This is what a memory card looks like, and also the RAM expansion cards look like this as well. So what you do is you stick it here in the back, and there it improves your RAM. I believe some games need to utilize it. Kind of like the expansion pack on a Nintendo 64, if that makes sense. If you have a Nintendo 64 and you get you need to stick something similar like this, but obviously smaller, on the top of your console, so you can have more RAM on your Nintendo 64, and you play games like Majora's Mask, I believe, use it, Donkey Kong 64, and Conker's Bad Fur Day. So I guess that's a good comparison. If you don't know anything about this, and then Nintendo 64 is like in your expertise, this is basically the same concept, right? So yeah, and it works either way, in the North America or Japanese console. But yeah, so it's pretty cool. This came with a Tamagotchi game, so that's it's it's very cute and pink. The pink color is very cool. I'll put it right here. And then okay, what else? Oh yes, let me show you the games. Who's the game? Right. So then here we have. I'm gonna show you some games, right? I'm not gonna show you all the games that I have. These are not all the games I have. I'm just gonna show you some games that maybe if you're interested in collecting, some key games that you should look out for. I try to keep it also games that don't require a lot of like reading in Japanese. That you can play without having to read Japanese, and maybe some games come in English, which is funny. But here we have Tamagotchi. I believe the game is called Tamagotchi Park, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, it's pretty cool. These are the jewel cases that come in Japan, right? In North America, it comes out. They come in long boxes, like a very like a long jewel case box. I don't know if you would call it like that, but in America, but in Japan, they came with the standard jewel case that you would see. That CDs will come back in the 90s, and also PS1 games, right? So this is what this is like the cardboard box that this game come in, right? The Tamagotchi game, and also the expansion part. So if I were to open it, you see it's like a slot where I put in the game, and then the the memory card or the expansion card, whatever you want to call it. I'll just leave this right here just for show purposes. Here we have Dragon Ball Z fighting game. You're into Dragon Ball Z, I'm sure you'll definitely love this game. This doesn't require a lot of reading. I think the only thing you that shows, the only Japanese text that would show is like the menus, but usually it's like, you click one or the other, and then boom, you just select the character and you go on a fight. Initial D, racing game, same thing. The only Japanese texts that you'll encounter would be like clicking menus, and choosing your car, and I believe also choosing the maps that you want to race on. Here we have Dead or Alive, same thing, very simplistic, not many, not heavy in text, just menu stuff, but it's a cool fighting game. Dead or Alive, obviously, becomes a successful juggernaut on the Dreamcast and on the PS2, and moving on to like the 360 and PS3 and PS4, etc. Then we have Nights into Dream, right? This is the Sega Saturn game to get. If there's a number one game I recommend everybody getting, or the first game you get, is Nights into Dream. Very cool game. This is by the creator of Sonic. And then you have on Christmas Nights into Dream, which is it's Christmas Answers Dream. I was trying to read the name. It's basically a Christmas version of the OG one, for the Christmas vibes. Let's see. Oh yes, since in Japan the Sega Saturn was a very otaku console. Um, a lot of developers, let's just say, would make very adult games for the console. Let's just keep it that word, right? Very eroge, and so it includes hentai, includes actual adult stuff. Let's just say. And here we have this game called the Yak Yukin Special, right? Let me see if I'm not butchering the name. Yes, the Yak Yukin Special, which basically is these girls, right? Um, you basically play strip rock paper scissors. Let me just keep it at that. You play rock paper scissors, and loser let's just say removes a piece of clothing item. So yeah, so in the event that you beat um them, these girls, you can choose from a wide variety of girls. In the event that you beat them in rock paper scissors all the way through, let's just say they'll fully reveal themselves. I'll keep it at that. Only play if you're 18 or older. We got Virtual Fighter, Virtual Fighter 2. I'm showing this. I also have Virtual Fighter 1, if you prefer that one, but I'm showing Virtual Fighter 2. Yeah, this is also the game that made the Sega Saturn extremely popular in Japan. Because one thing I will know about the Sega Saturn is that it's a very good 2D machine, right? It's a powerhouse for 2D games. The 2D games look beautiful. It's just unfortunately it doesn't do 3D games as well as the PlayStation and the Nintendo 64, because this was built in mind that Sega thought that we were gonna move into, how do I say this, 3D character models. No, was it 2D games with 3D sprites? Is that how I'm wording it right? Meanwhile, Sony and Nintendo, they made their machines with full 3D in mind. I think I'm not butchering uh, this. I think from what I remember correctly. Yes. So how I said that there's no mainline Sonic games in this console, that is true. So these are some of the only Sonic games that come out. Sonic Jam, which is basically just a compilation of Sonic 1, 2, 3, and Knuckles. So it's like, it's the same games you would have played in the Genesis, just all in one game. And then we have here Sonic 3D Flicky Island, which is basically Sonic 3D Blast. It's basically the spin off port from the Sega Genesis. And then there was Sonic R, which is the racing game. Now, you run in foot and race. But I actually couldn't find it. It's somewhere there. I couldn't find it. That I wanted to show you guys as well. And yeah, so that's basically some of the games I wanted to show you. Those are some of the games I would recommend, like Nights into Dream, Virtual Fighter if you love fighting games that are live. I guess pick up one of the Sonic games. I would probably say Sonic Jam. If you haven't played the original Sonic on the Genesis, like the 1, 2, 3, and Knuckles, I say play Sonic Jam. Get it so you can have all in one disc. But yeah, let me know what you guys think of the Sega Saturn. I like this console. I think it's very underrated. I definitely prefer the PlayStation over it, but I also prefer this over the Nintendo 64. So yeah, do you guys plan on collecting it? Let me know what you guys think.
One great point that I forgot to mention is that also in E3 of 1995, when Sega was announcing that they were gonna release the Sega Saturn in America within that same week, etc., etc. The Sega Saturn was also priced at $399, $400. Meanwhile, then PlayStation took the stage right after, and they announced that the Sony PlayStation, right, was going to be $299, and that's where you get the famous clip of him going up on stage and saying $299. So it's like consumers and the rest of us, we would see, right? We would be like, okay, this new PlayStation thing from Sony seems to be more powerful, and also is $100 cheaper at 300. Meanwhile the Sega Saturn was a weaker machine. not as powerful as a PlayStation, and $400, which is, $100 more than the more powerful console. So it also, it made more sense to people obviously go to the PlayStation and not choose the Saturn because, the Saturn was $100 more expensive and also a weaker machine. Excuse me, a weaker machine. So that's another thing that led to its failure, especially here in America. Another thing too is that um, Sega Saturn, it had very good arcade ports. So you got to keep in mind, in Japan, arcades were still striving. During the mid '90s, and even till now, arcades are still a pretty popular thing in Japan. But by the mid '90s in America, arcades were pretty much dying off. Arcades weren't as popular as they were back in like the 80s, even like late 70s. It was just a thing that was just fading away in America. But in Japan, they were still thriving. So in Japan, the Sega Saturn was basically viewed as, what? Arcades are still a big thing, and the Sega Saturn was an arcade machine at home. So you get to play stuff like Daytona USA, Virtual Fighter, Dead or Alive, all those great arcade games, the shoot 'em ups, the beat 'em ups, the fighting games, the racing games, everything. It was very attractive to the Japanese players to buy a Sega Saturn as well, so they can play those arcade ports at home. Meanwhile, that same scenario did not apply here in America because nobody gave a crap about arcade games anymore here in America. So that's another reason why the Sega Saturn did extremely well in Japan compared to America, and that's probably also why it was doing very well in Japan compared to the Nintendo 64. It was more attractive to Japanese players to get a Sega Saturn over Nintendo 64, and for the longest time, also the Sega Saturn was outselling the PlayStation. It wasn't until late 1997 with Final Fantasy VII is that in Japan, finally the PlayStation outsold, excuse me, the Sega Saturn. So yeah, so it's just more things that unfortunately just led for the Saturn to not be as great as a success as its predecessor, the Genesis, and also the Saturn also not being as popular and well demanded here in America, at least compared to either the Genesis popularity in the States or the Sega Saturn's, popularity in Japan. So yeah.
And yeah, I guess one more thing before I go, I will tell you guys my history and how I discovered this console, and my brief history on how I got interested in this console. Well, I was looking at a documentary, right, a Sega Dreamcast documentary, and I remember thinking, right, because obviously back then a lot of people here in 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 North America, you don't know that this console existed. You don't know because it wasn't a popular. People would like think of Sega would be like the Genesis, and then to a lesser extent the Dreamcast. So I was looking at a Dreamcast documentary, right? Seeing how how did the Dreamcast how did it fail? What happened that made them like fail and made Sega stop making consoles. So then in that Dreamcast documentary, they were going through history of the console. So that's how I learned of the Sega Game Gear, which is the portable Sega that competed against the Game Boy, the Master System, the SG-1000, and the Saturn. And I was like, wow, this looks pretty cool. It reminds me, it looks like a lot of like PS1 games, and that's because it was during that era. And on top of that, also Adam Koralik did a video on Sega Saturn, and he does some other videos, when on the games that he gets on Sega Saturns, and I believe he does videos on on Game Sharks and stuff like that. This thing called the Pseudo Saturn that you put in and turns your console region free. And he did a whole video of him explaining the whole Sega Saturn and the collection of games and the history of it. So that also very interested me in the games and in the console. So I went and I got a Saturn, and I got some games. Right, I started out with two games. I think I started out with Virtual Fighter because it came with it, and also Nights into Dreams because it came with it. And then I was hooked, and then I started, looking at more history, more videos, more specifically from Adam Core Lake and other YouTubers. I was like, wow, this console is pretty sick. I really like it. Everything about it is just so cool. Especially the Japanese stuff because I'm very into Japanese games. Like I said earlier, I don't like it how a lot of um, consoles, they have games that only come out in Japan but never come out everywhere else, like in North America or Europe or anything. But so it's like the fact that a lot of the games were out of reach and only in Japan, it made me even interested even more. And like, wow, okay, this game comes out. So that's why stuff like I think I showed Initial D and stuff like that never came out in Japan. I mean, never came out in America, only came out in Japan. Excuse me. I was like, wow, I love Initial D anime. So let me see. And I remember I looked up gameplay on YouTube on Initial D and it looked so fun. And I got it, through Nyokyo, I believe, or Bai, and yeah, and Initial D was just as fun as it was shown in the YouTube videos, and then I have a decent collection, not too much, because even though they are cheap, the Japanese games, unfortunately most of them are kind of unplayable, in terms of the fact that a lot of them you need to read Japanese if you want to know the whole story, or just a bunch of text what the characters are saying when they're talking to each other is all in Japanese letters, or they speak Japanese, so it's like it sucks. um, I would one day make the effort so I can learn how to read and learn how to speak Japanese and understand Japanese, so I could basically have the whole library open to me and I can just play everything I'm not limited to. But for the time being, it's a very decent collection. I won't say small because obviously all these games that I showed, these are not all the games that I have. Um, I have more, and but I also at the time I'm also a, how do I say this, looking for one of the expansions that's called the Pseudo Saturn, that I can also region unlock the consoles, so I can play this console, because I mainly want to use this one, the American one, so I can play the games in the American games. So for example, the Jurassic Park game that I have, and also play the Japanese games in this console. And then some in this I can use it here, so that also, so I can keep this one. I don't have to wear it as much, because the voltage, even though it's very similar, right? And you could use this in American voltage. Over time, it deteriorates because it's a very small difference. It's not crazy. Like for example, if you import something from Europe to Japan or America, the voltage in Europe is like completely different. So the moment you plug in something from Europe here, or something from here or Japan in Europe, it fries up your device, because of the voltage being so high, or just the difference. But here in America and Japan, it's very similar. But I believe it's 110 um, in Japan, and here in America is 120, which is very similar. It's like the difference is so tiny, but over time it will just fry up the insides. So I kind of want to avoid that, but you can still use it. Like I explained earlier. I encourage you guys to look and into this console and buy stuff and buy the games and play them. And don't be afraid. Plug this in and then you can play it on your thing. Um, but it's not like it's gonna fry your console within a week. No, no. I think you could like run a good 15 to 20 years with it. I've known people who they said that they've had a Japanese Saturn since the 90s, and we're in 2024, and their console still works fine. Um, so I guess to their testimony, I guess it takes a really long time for it to the difference in the voltage of the regions for it to have an effect. But for me, I guess I'm a crazy perfectionist. I guess I'm looking into the Pseudo Saturn, which is what it's called, which is like one of these that also have a memory. It acts as a RAM expansion. It acts also as a memory card, and it acts as the hack that makes everything region free. So this console. So I'm looking into that. But yeah, so that's what I'm focusing on, the Sega Saturn right now. I'm not focusing too much into getting more games, because right now I'm kind of into that PS3 mode, PS4 mode, because I know those consoles soon they're gonna go up, right? So I want to strike while it's cheap. But yeah, let me not get off too much topic. And other than that, I highly recommend this, and that's my history getting that console. I got this on, I believe it was Nyokyo or Bai, one of those two. I just imported from Japan with some of the stuff, the games, and then this one I bought it off a local seller. I found him on OfferUp, and we met up at a McDonald's, and I bought it from him. And it had the Jurassic Park game in it, and I think two controllers or three controllers, something like that. But and then all the cords and everything. So yeah, amazing console. I really like it. I actually really like this console. Will it be in my? Is it in my top 10 favorites of all time? Probably. If it is, it's like in the low ends, like number 10 or number 9. And if it's not, then it's like very close, like 11 or 12. Um, I guess it would be outside the top 10 if I'm including handhelds in that list. But if I'm excluding handhelds and no handhelds are in the list, I think it would just make the top 10. But yeah, other guys, let me know what you guys think of this console. Do you have the Sega Saturn? What are your favorite games on it? Are you planning to get Saturn? What do you think of it? Compared to the Genesis and the Dreamcast. But yeah, thank you guys for watching. Peace.